Hey, shalom, guys, and welcome to Wisdom in Torah Ministries. It's always nice to be here with you. Today, I have special guests, and I want to share with you what I'm learning and also the people that I'm trying to learn from in my journey of ancient Near Eastern history and also Mesopotamia history, connecting it with the Bible. And I have a special guest. I reached out to this gentleman. He's a professor, very renowned professor of ancient Near East and expert in Mesopotamia. And I reached out to him via Messenger. He actually answered, and we've been trying to develop a friendship and a relationship in the scholarly world. And he turned out to be a really, really nice person and gave me some time. And I'm honored that he was willing to share with me some of the stuff he's learning. I invited him to do a podcast, a type of an interview. He actually said yes. So I'm really blown away by his hospitality, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity. Now, to give you an idea who he is, I want to give a little intro to his bio. Not something that he gave me. He doesn't like bios, but I thought for the sake of the audience and what we're trying to do, I think we need to pay honor to those people who paved the way for us. He is responsible for some of the very well-known commentaries. This is the Bible background, IVP at Bible Backgrounds Commentary, the Old Testament. He's one of the editors and writers of it. I'm very beneficial of that. He's actually has one of the few resources, the same book, but in Spanish. So it's very, very good information. So who is Professor Mark Chavalas? Now, let me give you a little background on him. Professor Mark Chavalas is a prominent scholar and historian specializing in ancient Near Eastern history and languages. While there is no formal autobiography authored by him because he doesn't like them, but he earned his PhD from University of California, also Los Angeles, UCLA, Ancient Near Eastern History. His scholarly focus is in languages, history, and archaeology of Mesopotamia, particularly the regions which comprise ancient Babylonia and Assyria. Also, he is known for extensive research on Mesopotamian literature, as well as his work on intersection between the ancient Near East culture and also biblical world. He has authored and edited very important books. For example, the Ancient Near East historical sources and translation, where he compiled translations of ancient texts and give readers insights into early civilizations. And I'm honored to have him here today. So I want to give him a welcome. We're also going to ask him questions and about the topic at hand. And he's been very gracious to accept my invitation. So welcome, Professor. How are you?
Hello.
Are you doing good? Thank you for joining us, by the way. I'm an honor that you're here, and thank you for the opportunity to interview you. And I want the audience to get to know you. It's something that as we continue to learn, and you probably don't know because you only met me recently, but uh, in an indirect way, you're very responsible for some of my development and my studies on the Ancient Near East, alongside Pritchard, Ancient Near Eastern Texts, Mendenhall, Sasson, Meredith Klein, MacArthur, Kitchen, and some of the other people that we talked about, Wayne felt that you work with some of them. So I want to thank you for your work and for the opportunity of the audience to get to know you a little bit better.
Well, thank you. I'm sort of mystified by that. All I can say is God works in mysterious ways.
He does, but you'd be surprised how many people uh, actually want to learn about this topic. It's as John Walton always says the Bible is written for us, but not to us, and you would attest to that. So I want to ask you some questions. First of all, where are you living now? Let them know what you're doing. A lot of people don't know you, and I want them to. So give them a little background about other than the introduction I gave you.
Well, like you, I'm a California boy, Southern California, but I've been living in the Midwest since 1989 when I got my position here at the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse. I am now currently emeritus, which just means I'm retired and I have a little card so I can get on campus and still use their resources.
Yeah, that's funny.
And so we're still living in La Crosse. We mainly because of our kids and grandkids, we can't move because it's our base. And so all that means is that I'm doing research, but I don't have to go over to campus to talk to anybody about it.
Great. One of the things that I've learned I started learning engineering stuff in 2010, and it kind of revolutionized my mind because as last week when we talked, your expertise is Mesopotamia. as you know, it's very significant that we understand that area of the world because our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, specifically Abraham came from that area. Many of the events biblically occurred in that area. So a lot of people are not informed about the importance of archaeology, topography, history, and especially in the area that you study. So, just as a quick intro, what are the areas within Mesopotamian history that you focused in mainly in your research?
Well, it's interesting. I sort of came by this way without a lot of knowledge. I simply knew what I liked, and I liked to study history. I liked to study the Bible and backgrounds. In fact, when I was being interviewed to get into UCLA, they had me being interviewed with the Greek history professor, and I kept on talking about Mesopotamia. And he says, "Well, I'm going to kick you down the hall to the Mesopotamian guy," and I really didn't even make the connection between the early stuff in the Bible until it was sort of until I was confronted with it.
Right.
And so I didn't do it through knowledge. In fact, if I would have thought about it, I probably would have gone to a Christian school and a seminary, but I didn't know any better. Although God knew what he was doing, because of course now I was able to teach in a secular context with a Bible believing faith. So I became so interested and enamored with the backgrounds to the Bible, Mesopotamian civilization. And a lot of it, I thought, well, this will, I think maybe being a young, immature guy, just finishing up my undergraduate, I thought, well, people will be impressed by this. And of course, it was just the opposite. You go into a room and they ask you, well, what are you studying? I said, well, I'm studying dead languages. Well, it wasn't a conversation starter. It was a conversation killer.
For sure.
But because of that, I continued into it and realized, oh my goodness, this really is important. I suppose it would be like, when we were younger, if your parents had a TV, it might have been a black and white TV.
Right.
You're not that much younger than me. But the point was that all of a sudden, you get a colored TV, you don't ever want to go back to the original. So once I began understanding the background to the ancient biblical material, I realized, wow, this is a whole different world. It doesn't mean that everything's changed. It just means it's been modified so tremendously.
So, which leads to my first question that I wanted to ask you. So, what, in your opinion, what are the most misunderstood aspects of ancient Near Eastern history amongst the general public? I've been teaching this for a while, and the first year, people they thought I was nuts because I'm trying to understand the Bible from its historical context and environment, which is something that in the Western world people don't really do. So, what has been the most misunderstood aspect of ancient Near Eastern history, in your opinion?
Well, maybe you are nuts for doing it, because I certainly think I am. But that's another story that we can talk about. Maybe we can get co-therapy or something. But I think what's most misunderstood is that the Bible was written in a real life context, and of course, a modern mind, and myself included, naively assumed that it was written in for our context. And I have to tell them, no, it's not. And of course, you and I were talking about John Walton and his famous, saying about the Bible written for us, but not to us, is that's really hard to cope with, because of course we're so self-centered, and understandably speaking, is that, we expect something to, have immediate impact on us. If I read the Bible, I want to be able to apply it immediately. And of course, especially with the Old Testament, that's not so simple, because it's not only written in another environment, it's written in an environment that's completely dead as a doornail to us.
Right.
We can look at the New Testament and we can at least see a connection between Greek and Roman times and ours, because of course we're the product of their civilization. I mean, 2/3 of English either has a Greek or a Latin root to it, and so we can go back to it and look at all our words, just like the word president or senator or whatever, and we can see a Latin root. Of course, you have to work hard to figure that out, and of course, it's easier for Hispanics to connect that, because of course it has a much more intimate connection with Latin than English does. But so that's one thing. But the Old Testament is something different. If you if you read through the Old Testament, usually people stop about halfway through Leviticus because, of course, it's like, wait a minute, this is really weird.
It's different.
It's all these taboos about,
Yeah.
menstrual issues and bodily emission, etc., and tattoos and all this other stuff. This doesn't make any sense. I'm done. There's no narrative. It's not even a story any longer, and so
Right.
it gets really hard. And so now I've devoted my life, at least my adult life, to trying to figure out and understand that, but more importantly, to try to figure out how to break it down for a public. And usually I found out, especially with my students, that they didn't know they were interested until they found out that they were interested.
That's true. That's very true. It's happened to me, by the way. And you know how that my whole interest in this whole thing happened, which in 2010, I was trying to teach the commandments, the Torah commandments, 613 commandments. And then I got stuck in the commandment that talks about that the priest should not go up the altar with uncovered, they have to dress all the way to their ankles in the garments. And I thought that's kind of odd. Why is it a ramp? And when I began to ask the why, when, where, how come, all that stuff, which leads us into big problems. And maybe that's why you and I study this. And I decided to call one of my friends who was my Hebrew teacher at the time. And he turned around. It took me forever trying to get the answer. He literally turned around, picked up the book that I still have right over there. he goes to the page and he goes, oh, in ancient Egyptian culture, they used to do this. I'm going like, how in the world can you find that answer in 30 seconds? And it's taking me hours trying to search it out. And he said it because the Bible was written in an environment that we are removed from. And that what led me to all the stuff. With that being said, what has been, and Sumerian languages, the Akkadian language, the Babylonian, the Assyrians, many people don't understand how important those languages were, specifically in the time of Abraham and the Sumerian. People don't know that Abraham was an Amorite. We talked about that, and and the cultures and the language. How much have you been able to understand the Bible based on trying to understand those languages? Well, some of them are kind of dead by now anyway, but we have evidence of that they existed.
Well, I suppose I do it by way of analogy. Now, let's say, okay, you're a Spanish speaker. How about if you didn't know what the origin of Spanish was, and you find out all of a sudden, oh my goodness, there's this language called Latin that's dead.
Right.
And then you realize, oh, now I understand why French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, are interconnected, why they're similar. And then you go back and you find out, oh, this is why this word means such and such and the like. Now, it's not exactly true, but of course, the biblical, Hebrew is a Semitic language. By the way, this is simply a linguistic term. It's obviously, a shock value term today, but I'm simply using it in terms of language. And there's lots of other Semitic languages. Most of them are dead.
Yeah.
And the one that was uncovered that was most sensational, not quite 2 centuries ago, would be popular. The popular way, one of the dialects is called Babylonian, but the most generic way of speaking it is Akkadian.
Right.
And Akkadian was, I would say, a great uncle to biblical Hebrew. Okay, so it's not a direct ancestor, but it's related to it. Okay, so and when Akkadian was first uncovered, they didn't really understand it, by the way. In fact, they called it Assyrian. This is why somebody who studies this is called an Assyriologist. And it sort of covers all sorts of different things, but they had a big problem. First of all, it was written in an alien script we called cuneiform. And by the way, if you think about it, any language can be written with any script. You could put Spanish into cuneiform if you wanted to.
That's true.
It just so happens that Spanish and English use the same, alphabet, the Roman alphabet, but you could use any alphabet. So there's a difference between script and language, of course. Thus far, I'm guessing they probably have found about 500,000 or more text in Akkadian. There actually are multiple languages written in the cuneiform script. For example, the British Museum has over 130,000, and really only a small percentage of them have been published. They've all been cataloged, but there aren't enough starving Assyriologists to go around to translate them. I'm guessing at the rate they're doing it, it might take a couple centuries.
I read an article a few years back, like 11 years back, that when you do ancient treaties, and you can help me and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have a problem with that. But when they do ancient treaties, they will do it in different. That's why there's two tablets, because they will do one for the if two kings, you and I come into a treaty, you write it in three languages: your language, my language, and the Akkadian, because the international language.
Yes.
And that's quite
That's right.
interesting because then the commandments, you have two tablets. People don't realize they were written on both sides, one for the Israel, one for God, but you don't need the Akkadian because this is directly for the Lord, you know.
Well, and who knows whether there was any Akkadian there. If you find those tablets, let me know.
That's true.
That would be fun. But yes, in the international treaties during the late Bronze Age, Akkadian was the international language, kind of like English is now, and
Yeah.
French was, and then Latin was before that, and even before that, Greek. And so Akkadian was international language. So if you're a Hittite king living in central Turkey
Yeah.
and you're offering a treaty to the Egyptians, your scribes will, in fact, we've actually found Hittite drafts of Akkadian,
Mhm.
and we know there would have been an Egyptian copy also. And so, in fact, we found nearly 350 Akkadian tablets at El Amarna in Egypt. And
Right.
so we know that the scribes were multilingual. Clearly, Akkadian was not their first language. And so there's no doubt about that. But Akkadian was being used. It's a great uncle to Hebrew. And why is this so important? Because really, there are upwards to about 2,000 words in biblical Hebrew. And by the way, I'm no Hebrew scholar, in my opinion, but there are about 2,000 words in biblical Hebrew that are single word attestations. And so they're really hard to
Yeah.
understand except their context. A silly example that I would use in my class, if I say the phrase, the quick brown Google jumped over the lazy dog, your first question is, well, what's a Google? And my answer
Yeah.
is, well, that's really silly. I know what it is. It's quick and it's brown and it can jump over a dog. But oh, you want me to be more specific? Sorry, I can't.
Yeah.
Until maybe I find the
So-
etymology of the word or the like. And so there are lots of words like that in Hebrew. If we're able to find a cognate in Akkadian, and by the way, there are other Semitic languages that are even closer, that at least gives us a fighting chance to figure out what the word might have originally meant.
So, it's interesting. You mentioned the El Amarna text, and as I was reading them, I found the adoption language. I found vassal treaty language. It's not of surprise to me that they were using some of the Akkadian script in the Hittite because there was a covenant between the Egyptians and the Hittites at one point during the time of the Bronze Age. So I'm not really surprised by that. With that being said, have you had an opportunity to look into some of the documents they found that talk about the real estate price of land during the time of the Hittite kingdom?
Well, yes. I mean, now here's the problem with by the way, with Hittite. By the way, Hittite, they were rather shocked. This is at the beginning of the 20th century when Grozny, who was actually working in World War I for the Germans, although he was, I guess he was a Croatian. And anyway, he was working on this material, and he was allowed to stay as a clerk working on the translation of Hittite. And he shocked the world by figuring out that Hittite was an Indo-European language. Nobody believed him for a while until he showed them a text, and they found the Hittite word for water was watar, which was shocking. And then they found the Hittite verb for to eat, essen, sounds like the German word essen. And so they said, oh my goodness. And so Grozny was able to figure out that it was an Indo-European language, even though it was Indo-European.
Yeah.
Here's the problem with Hittite. We have very few, all the texts we have are basically from major cities that are connected to the crown. So we don't have the average contract that we find in Mesopotamia amongst Hittite texts. Hittite
Got
texts run right now about maybe 50, 60,000.
Yeah.
And so we don't have the average. So when it comes to sale documents, for example, and price, they're not in Hittite, they're in Akkadian.
Right. Right.
We actually find lots of those in a period before the Hittite Empire. from Assyrian, what do you want to call them, traders who were interacting.
So that only shows the interconnectedness of the ancient society, though.
Yes.
I mean, that's something that we don't. For example, when I'm doing my research on the Torah portion for Balaam and Balak, many people don't know that Balaam was from the same area that Laban lived.
Right.
In Padam Aram, which is a very important place in the geography in that place. So,
right, and of course, Balaam, by the way, has been found in a fragmentary text in a Western Semitic text quite a bit later in the Iron Age. There's a fragment of a Balaam story, and so it's pretty obvious even in the Bible that he's a pretty famous guy,
right?
And of course, if you think about it, sort of tongue in cheek, he's a famous guy who's sort of made to be a donkey because, of course, since the donkey was the most ignorant and stupidest of all animals, and by the way, it still is in the Middle East. I remember going there, and the worst thing you could call somebody would be a jahesh, a donkey. And my guys would interact back and forth. But if somebody brought up the word donkey, it's like, okay, you've just crossed the line, buddy. No more insults.
So that means, wait a minute. So that means that the biblical story is actually insulting him.
Yes. Exactly.
Oh, I did not know that.
This guy in the Near East who is schooled by a talking ass. And so there's, to me, it's more than irony. It's supposed to make the listener laugh, like, oh my goodness, that's the silliest thing I ever heard.
Right. Yeah, you have a very good course on logos, by the way. If you have logos, I highly recommend your course on women in the ancient Near East. Right. And you learn a lot because today in the Western world, women have a very different role than it was in biblical times. For example, there's an argument amongst Torah followers that women want to wear the sitiot. It's called the tassels. But as you know, in ancient culture, it was patriarchal in nature. It was basically men were always leading ahead of the curve, in the public arena because of honor and shame. So I'd like to know a little bit more about the role of women in Mesopotamia in the ancient area, and also in regards to temples, if we have anything on that. Because I know in the Greco-Roman world, they have, priestesses and stuff in some places. But I'm kind of curious. And that's one of your areas that you've really done a great job on.
Well, in Mesopotamia, we have loads and loads and loads of documents that have females as subjects, although they're usually not the main subject. And so, of course, I think we mentioned this last week when we chatted, is that we're asking questions about the documents that they have no interest in answering. And I think the Bible is the same way. And so if you ask what were women like in Bible times, my first argument is that the Bible isn't interested in answering your questions. So you've got to really, dig a little deeper. And so the same thing with Mesopotamia. We find women who are heavily involved in contracts, in legal texts, and are talked about quite often in the law codes. However, what we don't know very much about is how they actually interacted on a personal level with each other. In other words, I look at it this way. If we were living in the ancient Near East, right now my mother would be the matriarch of the family, although I would be the head of the extended family because my father has passed. Okay. However, because of my personal relationship with my mother, this is how things would probably go. Hey, Mom, guess what? We have to sell some property right now. And though I have the legal right to sell it without you, you have the emotional power over me because you're my mom. And so I want to do anything to make you feel bad or make you upset with me. So, Mom, do you think it's okay if I sell this plot of land?
Yeah.
Maybe if I had a bad relationship with my mother, I would do it anyway. But the point is, for example, at one site in late Bronze Syria along the Euphrates River, there was a city called Emar, E-M-A-R. And I would really look this up because it has really powerful relationships with the Bible. There, a father who is basically doling out his inheritance before he dies, he'll write to his sons. He'll appoint one of his sons as firstborn. It doesn't have to be the one who was born first necessarily. But he'll also say, let's say he has three sons. he'll write to each of their son, okay, I'm giving this to this son, this to this son, this son. However, I'm appointing my wife as father right now. In other
Right.
words, she's going to be the legal inheritor. And so you have to take care of her until she dies. And if you sort of diss her at any reason and she feels that way, you will be disinherited because she's the father. If he has no sons, he can appoint a daughter as a son. Now, that doesn't mean she's changing her
Right.
gender. It means that she's legally changing her gender. And so she has the legal power. So I'm saying that the legal and social power in Mesopotamia was clearly patriarchal, but I'm guessing that behind the scenes it was probably not a whole lot different than our culture.
Right. It's more because of culture and the role of man within that culture too.
Right. And so this is, by the way, this is why I think, when Peter in second, what is it, First Peter 3, when Peter talks about the fact that men should be basically compassionate to their wives because they're a weaker vessel. All he's saying there, by the way, is guys, it's pretty obvious that you can overpower your wives because men tend to have a bigger
Yeah.
upper body strength than women. So don't use it to your advantage.
Yeah.
Because and so I think the same thing happens in Mesopotamia, is that I could physically overpower my mother, but boy, I would feel pretty crummy if I did that, and everybody else would.
For sure.
And so I
For
wouldn't
sure.
even think of it.
Absolutely.
We
You
talk-
know, it's interesting because, for example, I was doing some research on women in the ancient Near East, and then I came into your course. But as I'm going through it, I found the story of Ruth very compelling because many people don't know in the Western world that a widow in the ancient world had three options: either prostitution, death, or slavery. So, the fact that she was willing to reject the only place she would have any kind of opportunity to have honor, her father's house, and
Yeah.
to have a husband and to have children, she was willing to forego all of that just to help another widow from another country. Shows the incredible character of Ruth as somebody who was truly moral and righteous, although came from a pagan background.
Right. No, I think that you're right, is that from a social standpoint, she's about the whole point of the story is to show that she's at the lowest point of the low.
Yeah.
She's got no options whatsoever, and she's basically pulling her lot in with Naomi. And really what she's saying is, I'm pulling my lot in with your God.
Mm-hmm.
And so she switched sides. She probably knows nothing about the God of Israel except from what she's learned from Naomi, and she wants to do it. And of course, her sister-in-law has decided that she's going to go her own way. And of course, biblical stories like to do that. It'll take the most unlikely person. It's the second child born or the most unexpected person, and they're the ones that are going to flourish in this. And so that why is this story being written down? Ruth is going to flourish. And of course, the whole point of the story is to show that David's got some good stock in his background, because everyone knows he's got some Moabite blood. It's okay because look how good a stock is. She put her lot in with Israel.
Right.
She switched sides.
I like the irony that, the guy who's supposed to be the redeemer didn't want her because he didn't want his genealogy to be defiled. And then in chapter 4, it outlines the whole genealogy. It's like saying God is the one who gives honor for righteousness and justice. That's really cool. I have a few more questions that I want to ask. And I really appreciate your time. I enjoy our conversation because, I really truly believe that in order to understand the Bible better, we have to put ourselves in its cultural environment. And I think you would attest to that. So with that being said, in Exodus chapter 14, verse 1, it gives us a very interesting story, how God tells Israel and Moses to go by Pi-hahiroth, to be right next to Baal Zephon by the sea. And many people don't focus much on that verse, but that is a very significant cosmological type, cosmic battle thing that if we go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and also Tiamat and Marduk and Baal and Yam, it will make more sense what the message is trying to convey there. What is the benefit, in your opinion, in understanding the myth of Mesopotamia and contrasting them with the biblical narrative, and also when they're heading to Canaan.
Well, I think it's kind of like when you're watching a movie or something, is that since you're born and raised in this culture, you already understand little ins and outs. And so if the producer decides to put a little blip in here, or if they want to make you think about a presidential candidate, they'll have somebody come in with wavy hair or whatever. Oh yeah, clearly that's supposed to be Donald Trump, or maybe somebody comes in who looks like Uncle Sam. So you'll know, oh, they're doing something that connects to the American myth, or what have you. And so, oh yeah, I recognize what they're doing, but an outsider, of course, would have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
So the same thing is going on here. It's not so much that the writer is directly addressing those things to attack them. He's addressing them to make fun of them. Everyone knows that in the pagan world, things are completely upside down. This is why, by the way, I cannot disconnect the Exodus story from Genesis. And so from the very beginning, when the writer, let's call him Moses, when he talks about the deep in the second verse of Genesis.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
That word tahom is clearly connected somehow to the word sea in the early Ugaritic text, which is Canaanite Tamtu, but it's also ultimately connected to the personal name Tiamat, who was the creation goddess in Mesopotamia. Although when I say creation, I'm going to put it in quotes because, of course, matter is eternal. The God personhood comes out of matter. I'm not quite sure how that works, by the way, since I believe in the reverse, but the point is personhood comes out of them. And so she's the one who creates or forms matter, and it basically goes against her ultimately. And so all these little things are in the background to the Genesis text. The readers will understand them. In fact, they probably understand them all too well, because I think in many respects, the writer is trying to deprogram his listeners. Because think about it. Think of Abraham. When Abraham follows the God of Israel, all it means is here's a polytheist who's now deciding to put his lot in with this particular God. Does he understand that all the other gods are negated yet? Perhaps not. And I think it probably takes him quite a long time, and maybe he doesn't even fully understand that, because I think the whole purpose is that he's changed sides. That's all that matters for him.
Yeah.
But here are these writers saying, the difference between polytheism and monotheism is a lot bigger than many gods and one God. It's a whole lot bigger than that. So I'm going to have to deprogram you. And so
24 years to deprogram him.
Yes. And so I think part of that is what's going on there. And it's really hard for us to understand that, because even when I talk to my students, I said, all of you guys are monotheists. And, and I remember a student telling me, well, no, I'm not a monotheist, I'm an atheist. I said, in order for you to be an atheist, you have to tell me exactly what it is that you're not believing in. And so basically what you're saying is, I'm rejecting that monotheistic training that I have, except that you think like a monotheist to say that. And so you only have a monotheistic framework.
Correct.
They didn't even have that.
Yeah.
In ancient Greece. And so I think this is what Moses is doing. And so there's something behind the scenes, I think, basically in every verse in the Old Testament, that they're wanting to make you think of something. And of course, my job has been to try to figure out what that something might be.
Well, I'm with you on that, because I've been on that same journey for 14 years. And the more I dig into it, the more I keep finding out. For example, when I talked to you last week and you mentioned that about Tahom in Genesis, I've read that text many times. And even though I've understood a little bit more about the great work that you've done, that John Walton has done, and all the other scholars of the ancient Near East, but sometimes, like for example, Yam in the Canaanite motif was the god of the sea, and then in the temple, the laver of the temple, Solomon calls it Yam. So the question was, why is the name of the laver where they have the water in the temple was called Yam? But I didn't know the story of Baal and Yam. Then when I read the story of the motif in Mesopotamia, then also in the Canaanites, when I go back to the temple, I'm going like, oh, is God showing authority over the underworld, over the Leviathan, and under the abyss? And then there's a prayer in Sukkot that we pray on the last day of Sukkot, right? Tabernacles, and it's quite interesting. It says, "May it be your will, may it be your will, O Lord our God, that next year we built our sukkah with the skins of Leviathan." And I thought, wait a minute. I know what Leviathan represented, the underworld and the dragon and the serpent. You mean to tell me that the Messianic age is the victory over death? That's what represented. So it's like a whole storyline trying to develop, like a really, like in Spanish, they have a soap. You know, you have to stick tuned to the storyline to know the outcome.
Oh.
And then you have Yeshua walking on water. See, that makes no sense to the Western world, but to somebody in the first century, that would have made perfect sense. You know, dominion over the underworld.
I think that you're right. When Jesus basically controls the water by walking on it, you know, the undertones are very powerful.
Yeah.
You know, for us, it's like, okay, walked on water. It's like walking on air. No, it's not.
Yeah.
It has meaning to it. And so
Isn't that fascinating? It's exciting because now you look at the Bible complete different eyes.
Yes.
You know, I was always curious, Professor, about, I know you told me to call you Mark, but I want to call you Professor because that's your title.
All right.
And I honor that.
I'll try to-
All right. Okay, so in Genesis, I was always wondering, why was it important for us to know that God created man out of the dust, right? You know, and then he blew on him the breath of life. Until I began to study the story of Khnum in Egyptian motif. It's quite interesting that he's the potter, you know. And what a contrast God is trying to convey in the book of Genesis. Like, no. It's not your God. It's I'm the one who give life. What have you found in your research of ancient Near Eastern culture when you read the book of Genesis, specifically the first 3 chapters? What do you get out of it? Because I know there's more to you and maybe to me than the regular listener because they're not really in tune with the background. So what do you get out of those 3 chapters as a scholar of the ancient Near East? What is the message?
I want to preface first because, and I'm sure you understand this, but maybe the audience is wondering if it's, wait a minute, do I have to do all this stuff to understand the Bible? My answer is no. This is what you can do to understand the Bible better, but
Right.
It doesn't. But you can be 4 years old and understand the basic truths of the Bible.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is icing on the cake from that standpoint, except that if you ask me what the icing is, it's really unclear. And so from that standpoint, this only enhances my understanding. And so it's like watching black and white TV and high definition. Oh, this helps me understand and see.
Yeah.
I see more things than I saw before. But it's still the same football game that I'm watching or whatever. So
Yeah.
So when it comes to creation, you know, when in Genesis chapter 2, which by the way simply answers a different question than chapter 1. You know, chapter 1 is the basic question of how did everything get here and how does this all work and what were we made for? Chapter 2 is more specific. How about the individual human? You know, how does that work? And so it narrows the focus. And the fact that God makes the Adam out of dust, which is the most inconsequential and dirtiest thing, and of course, you know, that's the thing that's on the bottom of your feet.
Yeah.
And so for God, basically, God is making fun of the rest of the ancient Near East. I'm going to make him out of the most inconsequential piece of matter that there is, dust. And then, of course, once he makes the Adam, he's not a living being until God does the opening of the mouth ritual,
Right.
to put the spirit into him to make him a living being, which is making fun of the ancient Near Eastern concept of divinity, because of course the ancient Near Eastern craftsman would be conducted to make a divine statue looking like a human being, by the way. But you want to make the goddess Ishtar, you basically make her out of wood, you get gold plating on her, but she's not the real goddess until you invite her in. You invite her spirit to come in. And so this is basically saying, well, God could do the same thing. He'll just take a piece of dust and and do the same thing and make it into a living being. And of course, then the human being is called the image of God, which in my opinion is a lot more mundane than we give it credit for. It's actually simply means the word in Akkadian,
Idol.
"Sela" means statue.
Yeah, it's idol.
Yes. And so what it and of course it'd be like Sargon going into a country and, well, all right, now I've conquered you, I'm leaving, but I want your tribute, so I'm going to make a statue of myself. So anytime you think about rebelling, you're going to look up and see my stern face staring at you. Well, that's what we are. We're God's representatives, except that we're animate,
Right.
real, and so it doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily mean we have all his qualities, but of course we do, because the next word, likeness. But the point is, we are representatives of the divinity on the earth. In fact, my colleague Mike Kaiser, he made up a word in English, imagers.
Oh, by the way, I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah.
Because let's go on that thread a little bit. Because sometimes we in the Western world do not understand when it says the Holy Spirit, and we use the word Holy Spirit as something that so common it loses the essence of really what it means. As you know, in the ancient world, common and holy was very significant, specifically in the Bible. So when I read the book of Genesis and I see how God breathed on Adam, makes him according to his image, and then he gives him the role to rule and reign on his creation instead of the mindset of Mesopotamia to be slaves to the gods.
Right.
What a contrast, my Lord. And then put his Holy Spirit in it to set him apart. Talk about a complete distinction. That's why idolatry is such an abomination of God. They're rejecting God's gift to serve and to worship something that can do nothing for them.
Well, and it's even more ironic than that, in my opinion. Think about it. If you put it in the context of Moses writing this to Hebrew slaves, they're thinking, "Oh, that's really cool. So we're all kings." Well, do you see my chains here? That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Of course, he's saying you weren't made for this. You were made to be,
Right.
royalty. And of course, in Mesopotamia, it's just the opposite. Human beings were as an afterthought to basically do all the dirty works the gods didn't want to do, like feed themselves, dredge canals, water, build temples, etc. And so if you think about it, in many respects, it changes the anthropological self-esteem to being the lowest on the totem pole to being the highest on it.
Raising the level of honor was huge. So
Yes.
with that being said, let me ask you, I read this and I want to validate it. Okay, so in the New Testament, it says that through Yeshua, the Messiah, Jesus, we are now made a nation of kings, right? And priests. Now, what I found, and I'm glad that you're here, maybe you can help me or redirect me to somebody who has the information. But I read in an article, and I can't remember, that in the ancient Near East, specifically in Egypt too, they believed that kings, prince, and priests were the people who only can hear the voices of God. That's why they have mysteries. Then the people who didn't have access to the divine. Only those people did, according to them. Now, it's interesting that when in the story of Joseph, I always wondered why Pharaoh gave Joseph a woman of high status as the daughter of a priest. I'm thinking, wait a minute, he's a slave. Why is he give him a woman of such high status? Then when I read this article, I went back to the story of Joseph, and I'm glad you are here with me so you can help me validate this. But when Joseph speaks to Pharaoh, he uses very peculiar language. He's saying, "My God has shown you," immediately identifying himself as a priest, although he never said he was a priest. So his wife that Pharaoh gave him was according to his same status. Is that correct? Looking at this,
something I'm gonna guess that could be true. I don't know enough about the Egyptian context to be authoritative on it at all, but I would say that in Mesopotamia, it's pretty much democratized that in other words, if you are a prophet, and by the way, our prophetic texts are only found in two different periods in Mesopotamia. This is by accident. One is Old Babylonian period, Mari, which is roughly the Abrahamic period.
right?
And it's only a period of about 20 years, and we have people who have prophetic oracles. And by the way, we're never told why and how a particular person is able to have an oracle. Although, for example, if you're a man or a woman and you've been sanctioned as a prophet or prophetess, then you'd have your union card that you can actually go into the temple. And what do? You probably take something, you lay in front of the god or goddess, and you fall asleep, or you get induced to fall asleep. And then when you wake up, you describe the contents of the dream, usually to the monarch. And it's, by the way, often very political. And it's the
Right.
same thing that happens in the Neo-Assyrian period. And so it's roughly analogous to the Bible, except in the Bible, of course, it seems like anybody, Tom, Dick, and Harry, can have the prophetic oracle, and it's usually the last person that you expect. You think about it, Moses is the last person you expect, and he argues vehemently against, his vocation that God gives him.
Right.
And so there, it's using individuals that are just sort of minding their own business, that are unexpected. Of course, this is what God always likes to do, is to use the unassuming person. In fact, even the nation of Israel is the most unassuming nation, on the
For
face
sure.
of the earth. This is why God takes them.
Mhm.
And so it in many respects, and of course, the ideology is that all humans are ultimately in leadership. And so even the ones who are on the lowest totem pole, in the totem pole socially, are used by God. In fact, they're the ones that are usually used, because then you have no excuse but to believe, because this isn't royalty. This
Right.
is the average person. And so this is why women are being used rather indiscriminately, it appears. In Mesopotamia, we do have female prophets, and also, by the way. And so it seems
So-
to, put it this way: the outer markings of Israelite culture look Mesopotamians, but when you start scratching the surface, you find out that they've overturned everything, because
Right.
the meaning behind their
Yeah.
customs are very, very different. That's really hard to understand, by the way.
Yeah. You know,
Sometimes you have to dig and dig and dig.
yeah, one of the areas, and then I like to expand a little bit more on this particular line. When I began to study on the priesthood, because I focus on the temple a lot, and I noticed that in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus, chapter 19 of book of Exodus, after the Lord says, if you obey my covenant, I'll make you a holy kingdom, a nation of priests. And then all of a sudden now everyone hears the voice of God. That would have been a shock to them, knowing that their level of honor was raised from slaves and marginalized people to like the status of priesthood. And it would have scared the living daylights out of them, really, now understanding the culture.
Yeah, no, exactly right. It's so shocking to them, because of course, our culture, at least socially speaking, is supposed to be completely democratized. In other words, at least in theory, everyone should have access to every service, and everyone should be able to, to go to Harvard if they want, or whatever.
Right.
But we know in reality that that's not necessarily the case. There's no taboo against it, but somebody who's from an unfortunate background probably has to work a lot harder to get to that point. Now, here we are in ancient Israel, and everybody has access, all at once. It's like, wait a minute, how does this work?
Yeah, especially oppressed people who basically were in exile. I got Man, I'm so happy to do an interview with you, because I had all these questions. I've been studying here. People know me, that they know that I focus a lot on this topic. And I had one person a long time ago. He called me. He said, "Man, I'm praying for you. You're going crazy, man. I mean, what are you doing?" And I said, "Look, where did you go to school?" And he told me. I said, "Did you study ancient Near Eastern hierarchy or covenants?" And he said, "Well, yeah, in college I did." I said, "Do me a favor. Go back 30 days. Go back and look at the structure and connect these verses." I gave it to him, and tell me if I'm crazy. For his credit, he called me back. He goes, "I never really thought about the Bible in this context." I said, "Why not? It's written in the environment of that people." With that being said, all right, so you have in John 1:1, people argue about, the identity of Messiah, but that's not really, I know he's pre-existent and divine. That's not the point. But the literary genre that John is using is very again, I have to be careful because people cannot handle sometimes when we try to make a contrast. When I go back to Genesis and I see how God breathed on Adam to be his spokesman and to rule and reign for him on the earth, everyone can agree with us, scholars do. Then I read John 1:1, it's like going back to Genesis, kind of basically saying that Yeshua will become the one who will speak on behalf, like Moses. Remember Moses? But my lips, I have uncircumcised lips. That's like the water, the opening of the mouth ceremony. Give him the authority, correct?
Yeah. No, I agree. Now, of course, though I have theological beliefs, I'm not trained in it, and so I try to avoid theology as much as I can in terms of speaking authoritatively about it.
Yeah, gotcha.
But I think that you're absolutely right, is that, the irony about Moses, that he refuses at every point, even with the staff. You think about it, the prohibition against magic in the original world in the Bible is not because it was false. It was because it wasn't false. The whole point was, don't dabble in that stuff. It's anti-God. It works. And so the Israelites use what you might call imitative magic. In other words, it's not really magic, but it looks like it because this is the venue that they're using. So Moses wants God to sort of, give him some verification. I'll paraphrase Exodus 3. What do you got in your hand there? Oh, I got a stick. All right, great. This is going to be we're going to use your stick. In other words, if he had a can of soda in his hand, that would have been the thing he would have used. He's the most inconsequential object. And of course, the same thing happens with his hand. His hand that changes. Well, and I think, by the way, the same way that Jesus performs miracle in the New Testament is pretty much the same way. It's rather ad hoc. It's like whatever, he doesn't have to do any long, soliloquy or monologue. He just sort of decides, I'll just heal. I don't have to go through all this whole process.
Yeah.
For example, if you have a sick child in Mesopotamia, you've got to go to the, either the Baru priest or the Ashibru priest, and after paying them money, then you've got to, a lot of it is the onus is on you. You've got to go through this long, elaborate ritual of speaking things and performing things and making some imitation things. And then if it doesn't work, the priest is going to say, oh, well, it'd be like it's like your strong password. Well, you didn't put it in correctly. Start over again.
But when people don't study that, then, like, for example, I found that in the story of the young lady who died, she was 12 years old. Why do I need to know that she was 12 years old? Unless we're following the prophecies about Israel, because death represented, removing away from the holy, from the sacred space. And all of a sudden now this little girl who's 12 happens to be 12 tribes. It's quite interesting how the contrast, they're sending you a message behind the message. So I want to ask you a quick question about, I've been asking me all kinds of questions. But I've been teaching a lot about royal messengers. I have one book here about royal messengers in the ancient Near East. And I know that royal messenger is very important because I believe, based on what the Bible tells me, that Yeshua, one of the functions and roles and purposes was to be God's royal messenger, like Moses was. And what was the focus of, if you studied it at all, about royal messengers in Mesopotamia, if any?
Well, but it's interesting that the word for the messenger in Akkadian is Mar Shipri, which literally means son of the message, son of the handwritten message.
Nice.
And they're a good messenger is the one who would go and speak the words of the king exactly in the way the king wanted it to be spoken. Okay, so the messenger themselves is de-emphasized, I suppose. And so, if I come to you, so, I mean, if I'm the Babylonian king and I want to interact with the Egyptian king, chances are we're never going to see each other. And let's say, we want to exchange our daughters for, marital alliance. The only one who can do it is the messenger, because they're going to travel all the way from Babylon to Thebes. And so in that doing it, basically the messenger has the voice of God, or I'm sorry, the voice of the king,
Right.
and he's speaking as if he is the king. Okay, so
Right.
he's not just the spokesman. He probably is like a cupbearer who is like second in command, or at least, I suppose to be like Secretary of State or something. Like, that this guy's, he's doesn't just have the ear of the king. He's got the mind of the king when he goes through there. And so I think that makes perfect sense that Jesus would be in the same way. Now, of course, we know that it's even deeper than that. Not only is he the spokesman for the king, he's the king.
Yeah, but so
incarnate.
So let me ask you a question. So when Yeshua says, "My doctrine is not mine, who the Father who sent me," that language goes hand in hand with ancient Near Eastern messenger language.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, that's something that I'm looking a lot into and trying to understand the whole function, purpose of Messiah. And, what's really helped me out a lot. For example, I read that when the messenger received the message, he cannot change one word.
Right.
He had to speak as if he is the king himself.
Right.
And that's really telling, because, sometimes we are so disconnected with the context. And now I understand why Pharaoh did not kill Moses and Aaron, because they presented themselves as the messengers of the great king. And the etiquette and the protocols were that if you kill the messenger, you have a problem. That's a declaration of war.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, so
I think you're perfectly correct in that. In the sense, it doesn't have to be addressed to the reader, because they would obviously understand that. Is that you kill the messenger? That's a big deal. You decided to all that war.
So
that makes sense.
Let me ask you a little bit about your contemporaries. I mean, you mentioned a few of the writers that I've studied, and it's kind of cool because we in the short time that we've been talking, I feel like I know you a little bit because I read a lot of your stuff, but it's better when you explain it, really. But you work with some really profound, very, very, very good writers and scholars like John Walton. And did you meet Pritchard by any chance?
No, Pritchard, I don't remember exactly when he died, but I think he was pretty much out of the picture. I think he was already in his 90s when I began my studies in the 70s, and so I never did get to meet him.
So okay, so you have Mendenhall, who is very, very important work from the Hittite perspective, that he moved the whole, by his research, they were able to consolidate a little bit more the writer of the book of Deuteronomy. Then you have John Walton, who's been very influential in trying to, understand ancient Near East, as well as alongside you and Meredith Kline and those guys. Tell me a little bit about Kitchen, because his book is very, very good. But, was his focus also Mesopotamia?
No, Kitchen was an Egyptologist.
Okay.
In fact, he still might be alive. I haven't heard that he passed yet, but he must be in his mid-90s now.
Yeah.
I met him once or twice. Absolutely brilliant man. Even when I met him 30 years ago, he was retiring, and he already had 30 books in his mind that he was now going to work on in the next 30 years.
Yeah.
But I guess my only caveat about him is that he is almost like he's St. George fighting against the dragon. So when he writes his work, especially what is it on the reliability of the Old Testament, that huge book.
I have it.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a review of it. And my argument about it is that he spends too much time belittling those who don't agree with the evangelical traditions.
Mhm.
I think that you sort of get stuck in the mud when you do that.
Got it.
And so that was one of my minor critiques about his work. Other than that, he is a model for us. And by the way, a name that we haven't brought up yet, maybe you don't know or don't know, is Harry Hoffner. Hoffner was
Mhm.
probably the greatest living Hittitologist until he passed away a few years ago. Also a Bible believing Christian,
Mhm.
a wonderful man. But if you do any work on Hittite, that's the guy to look at. He also was connected to biblical studies, and so he's. I'm standing on his shoulders.
Yeah.
So
Well,
Walton and I are both standing on his shoulders.
yeah, you mentioned something that you wrote a report on, a critique, but I like to talk a little bit about that because in the circles that I dwell in, unfortunately, there's no peer review. Um, and what I read and everywhere I'm reading, every time, there's a level of respect between scholar and scholar, and you
Yeah.
can present your information in a peer review. And I had to learn to do that. So to the point that now, I mean, nobody likes to be criticized for a particular point, but I think what I'm learning in the scholarly world is that there is a way of doing it that is respectful based on the work, not on the person.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I so really appreciate that. And I think that's something that we can learn from the regular believers that not necessarily dwell into the scholarly world, that you don't have to be a scholar to disagree with
No,
somebody on the information, still respect the person.
that's exactly right. And
And
it's tough because we were sort of trained that way at the beginning. And because I was basically my first, week as an Assyriologist in training, we were told, you don't know anything, by the way. And even after being trained like this, you really aren't going to know much of anything. There's always going to be somebody else who knows more. And the material that you're learning will be overturned the next time we find something in the ground. So you have to learn how to be humble.
yeah,
And so it's supposed to spill out into like, for example, when I gave when I gave my first academic paper over 40 years ago, and thinking, oh my goodness, it's as if you're going out there and you're in your undergarments because you know that you've given this paper and there's somebody out there who's gonna um uh
yeah,
say, oh, did you think of this and this? No, I didn't. And the humble way of saying it is, oh, thank you so much for helping me. I didn't think of that. I'm going to go back and think of that. I remember the first time I did a paper in a very difficult Akkadian root that had a connection with the Bible. The foremost legal scholar in the Mesopotamian world, Raymond Westbrook, was in the audience.
oh, Westbrook, he was in the audience.
I said, why is he here? Oh, this is terrible. And so I gave my talk and I'm
Yeah,
thinking, this is way over my head. Oh my goodness, he's going to destroy me. He stands up. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm dead. He says, I think you're right about this. This is really great. I hadn't thought of that particular issue. And then he came up with me afterwards and said, if you didn't think of this, you could, he gave me all these pointers. I'm thinking,
yeah,
oh my goodness, that's how I want to be
yeah.
to everybody else is, in many respects, it's really, if you think about it, these are Christian virtues that you should be using.
Well,
I would like you to treat me the way I want to, that I want to be treated. Is that it's humility? Oh, had you thought of this? Maybe,
yeah.
maybe you could be wrong about this.
It's
And it's
not
hard.
it's not easy. It's not easy being wrong, and that's why I got my teacher 14 years ago. He's a former expert on the temple, and I've been focusing with him for the last 14 years. And the great thing is that the more I talk to him, I've been able to share with him some of the ancient Near Eastern contrast to the holiness of the temple, contrasting it with ancient Near East. A lot of Mesopotamia comes up, and the great thing is he looks at me, he goes like, I didn't think about that. And that's that and I love that because now it creates an exchange of areas that I need and areas that maybe he's not focusing in. And it's not like he wants to be an expert on that, but at least it complements. So
Yeah.
every time we study together, I could present a thesis to him. He'll listen to it, and I love him because immediately he goes, "Hey, by the way, let me show you a few verses that supports what you're trying to say." And unfortunately, it's hard to find people who are willing to have those conversations because it's difficult to admit when you're wrong. And I had to learn the last 14 years that I've been wrong before a lot and I'm still growing. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I want to connect with you because if I have a question about Mesopotamia, I have direct access now. Thank you for me to ask you. It's one thing to read it, but then going to the person who wrote the article, it's like you can point me in
Yeah.
different directions, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, really, and I'm honored.
It's my pleasure. I'm more than happy to continue this up as long as we get to talk about baseball once in a while too.
Oh, we will for sure. We'll do that. See, I found out that you like baseball, and I was a baseball player professionally.
Yeah.
Except that I look a little different now than I did when I played. Thanks for mentioning that. By the way. It's only been like 30 years, you know.
Yeah.
But we can definitely talk about baseball, and I'm looking forward to maybe get to meet you and talk a little more. And I'd like to ask you one more question about a writer that I have down there.
Sure.
His ancient, what's it called, civilizations of the ancient Near East, Sasson.
Oh yeah, Sasson.
Sasson, thank you. Sasson. I mean, I read those big old books when I was doing, oh my, that was a lot of information. I don't remember half of it, but I tell you, tell me a little bit about him. Do you know him?
I do.
Yeah, I mean, his work is so really impressive. What he did.
I love that man because first of all, he's very personable. He's not a typical Assyriologist in the sense that he just has this aura about him. As when he's about, oh, I don't know, 12 or 15 years older than me. And so in many respects, when I first started going to conferences 40 years ago, he would take some of us under his wing and say, oh, I mean, he would come down to our level because
Yeah.
of course we're nervous. Oh my goodness, this is Dr. Sasson that we're meeting.
Yeah.
He says, oh, come on, boys, let's go to lunch. And he would talk and he would interact with us on an equal level. But he's so brilliant because he's one of those Assyriologists and of course he's a biblical scholar, but he's also expanded into literary theory and other areas. In other words, he's a very well-rounded person. So he's able to bring a lot of other disciplines into his work, and he does it quite often tongue in cheek. And so I really like his material, and I will interact with him occasionally. I remember years ago, I was doing a Bible study on Jonah at my local church, and I was using Jack's commentary on Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even remember what the topic was, but I brought up something that he had mentioned in his book, and I talked about it to class, and it was very meaningful to the class. So I wrote to Jack and said, hey, Jack, do you realize that I just used your commentary, at this very mundane level? And he wrote back, he says, you can't believe how much this means to me to know that, he's Jewish, by the way, and he's personal. And so, but he looked at, in fact, he's an Iraqi Jew.
Yeah.
And so, but he wrote back and said, this is a personal level. In other words, I wasn't just writing to him to talk shop. And recently, I might mention this to you. I don't know if I was talking to somebody recently. He has a list server, by the way, called the Ancient Near East. And in fact, you might want to look this up and join it because you get all sorts of news information.
Okay.
So just Google Jack Sasson Ancient Near East.
Okay.
Whatever. And if you can't find it, just connect. Well, I wrote to him and said, hey, Jack, I've got a new email. Can you put this in? He says, oh, yeah. And then he says, hey, what are you up to? And I told him I'm recently retired. And he says, well, how old are you? Because, of course, when you're talking to somebody younger, you always keep them at that age.
Yeah.
I said, oh, I just hit 70. He says, oh, you're an infant.
How old is he now?
Well, he's in his probably early 80s.
Oh, I'm hoping that hopefully I'll be able to meet him someday and get it. So his book has been tremendous.
He's an accessible person, by the way. And so I can't speak for him, obviously.
Yeah.
But he writes back. And so anyway, in other words, he's a very special Mesopotamian Near Eastern scholar who has a very human face to him, and he's not shy about allowing it to come out.
Wow, that's great to hear. Because I remember when I got the volumes, I was just starting, and I was looking for credible information on the ancient Near East. And John Walton, you came on, and then Meredith Klein, and also Sasson, right? So I got it. And when I began to study, when I got the books, I'm going like, am I going to be able to get through all of this? But let me tell you, when you go through it and you start paying attention to some of the little details, it's amazing the amount of information that we need to learn about the Bible that we don't know. It was really, really amazing to me. Professor, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I hope that we continue to do this more often. Maybe in the future we can do like one topic and then talk about it instead of so many questions at one time. I think the audience, it would be great if they get to know you a little bit about some of the information you got to offer, because it would only help us and it would enhance our understanding of the Bible. Specifically the life of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They lived surrounded and influenced by that particular, specifically also Israel when they went to Babylon and Persia. You know, the whole area is important. So, where can they find you? Are you connected with anything? Are you teaching anywhere now? Enjoying retirement? Is that it?
I'm officially retired, but of course you have my email there, so I'm always happy to have people email me, so that's no problem. So in a sense, I've thought really a lot about, all right, what do I want to do in retirement? And sort of things have been dropped in my lap. I've decided, all right, this is type of a ministry. I want to be able to expand into a public audience and simply like you to make these type of things accessible to the public. And of course, I would have no access to a Spanish speaking public like you do. And so it's like I'm quite bewildered by this. And so,
all my students know you. They know the book. I mean, I recommend it every time. So
that's bewildering to me, of course, because they translate that book into Chinese, into Arabic, into other languages too. And I'm thinking, okay, I had nothing to do with that. That's great.
Yeah.
So really, I'm students can interact with me on an ad hoc basis, and so they can have the same type of random questions that you might have. And I'm, in other words, this is what I consider my ministry, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like what happens.
Well, I'll tell you what, man, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity, and I'd love to learn from you, and I would love to do more research. I mean, I decided 15 years ago that this was the journey I was going to go. I went back, got my bachelor's in engineering. I want to continue to pursue my education, and if with your help, I know I'm going to be able to be. The good thing about having you as a resource directly is like last week, you gave me an article and I read the article, and I had 3 of my students read it with me, by the way, because of peer review. I want to make sure that we go on the right path.
Sure.
And, it's great because you say, okay, this particular writer is the authority on this area. So you're really helping me really narrow down the options. Sometimes we get lost in all the books, and, and I don't want to do it like that. So I really appreciate it. And by the way, if you have logos, to the audience, if you have logos, consider your course, on women in the engineering, correct?
Yeah, and then the second one, there's women in the New Testament world.
Right. So very good resource to have, and I highly recommend it. So I don't know if you're interested, but I don't mean to do it here publicly, but I think I kind of mentioned it to you, but it will be great if we can maybe once in a while continue to do some kind of a podcast, take a topic and let you expound on it a little bit so the audience can learn a little bit more about some of the biblical context in light of Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. I think that would be very beneficial. And I have an agenda. I want to learn, but also I want the audience to also see that I'm not the only crazy person. That there's also crazy people that like baseball like me and who also like the ancient Near East.
Well, no, I'd be more than happy to. So,
all right.
So I'm all in.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor. It's an honor to have you, and I look forward to spending more time with you and learning from you. And all the audience that are watching, consider joining wisdomandtorah.com. Join us. I'm studying there. As you know, I have courses there, and also I'm going to put, with the permission from Mark, I'm going to put some of those videos on my website. So if you want to go and check it out and validate some of the information, it will be greatly appreciated. So God bless you guys. Thank you for joining me. And I look forward to spending more time with you, Professor, and also with the audience, learning more about the Bible in light of the ancient Near East. Shalom to everyone. Bye-bye.
Pleasure's all mine.
God bless you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you guys again. And thank you for the opportunity. As you can see, we're trying to move forward and learning more new things, and connecting ourselves with people who will allow us. And again, we never really talk about theology and stuff. We're only looking at the information. I'm not focusing on the things that we may agree or disagree. Right now, that's not important. But we're looking to complement what he knows, so we can understand it better, to encourage our faith and to make us better servants of Messiah Yeshua. Shalom to all of you. We'll see you guys soon. Bye bye.